Today we have a very important guest to discuss the maritime industry. So the topic for today is greening the maritime sector, policy pathways, and implementation challenges. If you are new to the channel, I urge you to subscribe to the channel so that we'll continue to bring you very insightful topics on the show. With me today is Numbu Issahaque Sumabe. Sumabe, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Can you introduce yourself to our audience and tell us what you do?
Yes, thank you once again. For purposes of today's discussion, I'll present two sides of me relating to the subject matter. On one side, I am formally, that is on the formal aspect, I'm employed with the Ghana Maritime Authority. I've been with the maritime industry for 16 years now, performing roles basically within maritime environmental protection, which of course includes issues about reducing air pollutants and greenhouse gas emissions from the shipping industry. That is part of my role, actually. And over the years, I've been the technical expert, the technical support for Ghana's delegation to the International Maritime Organization, where these negotiations on greenhouse gas emission from shipping takes place. But that being said, I want to kind of issue a disclaimer here today that I'm here on personal capacity, and the views that I'll be expressing here are mine and not that of my organization. And on the second part, which is more private, I belong to an organization called the Professional Technical Network, Professional African Technical Network Initiative, which is an all-African professional group, basically drawn from academia, the policymakers, civil society organizations, and mostly with a focus on marine and blue economy issues. Our main goal is to help the African continent to bring them to speed on current developments. And one of the issues that we've been dealing with is maritime decarbonization.
Well, talking about maritime decarbonization, what does it mean? What is even the maritime industry? You know, our viewers, I believe some may not understand the maritime industry. Can you take us through what the maritime industry is and what is maritime decarbonization, or what is decarbonization?
Yes. So the maritime industry involves everything that has anything to do with maritime transportation. So here we are talking about sea-related transport, and also by extension the inland waterways as well. So we are talking about port, where the ships come to dock. We are talking about the ships themselves. We are talking about other activities, shipbuilding activities, ship repair activities, dry docking activities, any activity relating to shipping, and it constitutes the maritime industry. And by extension, we're looking at the cargo flows as well. So by decarbonizing the maritime industry, it is basically trying to say that we are trying to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions from the industry. That is emissions from the ships and emissions from port operations as well.
Okay, thank you. We know that the shipping industry contributes a lot to greenhouse gas emissions, but the sector is also very difficult to decarbonize. Why is it the case? And what has made it so difficult for the shipping industry to decarbonize?
Yes, so a lot is relative, but it depends on how you look at it. The shipping industry actually contributes about 3% GHG emissions. So but as to whether that is a lot or not, it depends. And maybe some people argue that it contributes little as compared to total GHG emissions from other sectors. And other people too of the view that this is quite significant. And besides, if nothing is done about it, it will continue to emit, and 3% can turn to 10%, and then to very high levels of emissions. Yeah, and with the maritime sector, it's quite complex. There are a lot of complexities, and that is why it is quite difficult to decarbonize the sector. And number one, the sector is linked to international trade. The seaborne transport constitutes about 80 to 90% of global trade, which means that the goods that are being moved in and out, a larger part of it is carried by sea. And by extension, any attempt at decarbonizing this sector will also mean that the trade, the cost of transporting these goods will be affected. So that is one aspect of the complication. The other aspect has to do with the fact that the sector is international in nature. So the emissions from the maritime sector from international shipping cannot be categorized within one state. So accounting for shipping emissions is quite difficult. Let me just use an example. For instance, you can have a ship flying the flag of Ghana, and let's say that the time we use of the Black Star shipping line, this ship maybe is coming from a port in United States of America. It fuels over there, bunker fuel, the fuel which of course contains pollutants and GHG gases. So it passes through Spain, offloads some goods, within the port, maybe bunkers there again, and then finally lands at the port of Tema. So you can see it has really gone through so many states, so many countries, which will make it difficult to, quantify the emissions. And even maybe Ghana, the flag that it's flying, or under any other, the waters the ports that has visited, you can't really allocate the emissions from that particular ship to those ports. So that is why from the onset, the maritime sector has been left out of the UNFCCC system, and also within the Paris Agreement. Yeah, the actual fact is that the maritime sector, those international sectors, including the maritime sector and the aviation sector, have actually been assigned to the international bodies overseeing these sectors. So the maritime sector, the Kyoto Protocol, for instance, assigns the emissions within the maritime sector to the International Maritime Organization, which is a UN body and a UN agency, purposely for ensuring safety of navigation, security, and also ensuring marine environment protection. So those are the major roles of the IMO. So that is why the IMO is now the international agency responsible for dealing with these international emissions. So basically, that is why it is quite difficult to tackle emissions within the industry.
So you mentioned various terminologies, and for instance, you mentioned the UN triple two, right? You mentioned. You mentioned the Paris Agreement, you mentioned the International Maritime Organization. Now, but I want us to focus mainly on the International Maritime Organization. What role have they been playing in driving global climate action? And is it moving fast or it's very slow?
Yes. So let me just start from where I stopped. So the question a lot of people have been asking is whether the efforts by the International Maritime Organization has not been just purely for business as usual. The argument has been that the IMO has been aware of its tasks, as I mentioned, since the inception of the Kyoto Protocol. But a lot of arguments span to the extent that not much had been done about it. But of course, the IMO since 2011 has been taking measures, devising strategies towards tackling emissions in the industry. So it began by instituting what we call energy efficiency measures. And these energy efficiency measures were of two kinds. One has to do with the ship itself, the design of new ships from 2013. the engines of the ships, the equipment used on board had to be designed in such a way that they will lead to lower carbon emissions. And the other aspect has to do with the operations of the ships. The ship managers or owners had to devise ways of ensuring that they don't emit more. And for instance, they could lower speed, but once the ship lowers the speed, they don't emit they don't emit higher greenhouse gases. And also ensuring that the engines are serviced. All those are operational measures. And then but this wasn't enough. In 2018, there was a significant move by the IMO where they came up with the initial greenhouse gas emission reduction strategy. But this strategy wasn't also ambitious enough because it basically aimed to halve emissions in the industry by 2050, which of course had been criticized as business as usual. So the significant attempt, by the IMO had to do with the revised edition of the strategy, the greenhouse gas emission strategy, which was in 2023. So this strategy had higher ambitions, and it aimed to reach net zero by 2050, by or around 2050. That is actually the language. But it has some choke points. So in choke points that by 2030, there should be GHG, the total annual GHG reduction should be between 20 to 30%. And then by 2040, it should be between 70 to 80%. And also, it also says that the amount of zero or near zero fuels or technologies used within on board ships should constitute about 5% of fuel sources. Basically, these were the components of the 2023 IMO revised strategy. This is actually quite ambitious. So this led to the design of measures to support the implementation of the strategy, which were called midterm measures. These midterm measures included a technical measure and also an economic measure. So there were various proposals submitted and negotiations undertaken at the IMO. And finally, the IMO arrived at a compromise position of what is now called the Net Zero Framework. And this is supposed to guide the implementation of the strategy towards ensuring that the industry achieves net zero by 2050. So I think that in the beginning, maybe the IMO was a bit sluggish in terms of business as usual, but towards this end, with the revised strategy, we could see that there's a bit of agency, and with the controversy surrounding the net zero framework, it even goes to show that it is even highly, that policy is highly ambitious. Like, that is how I can describe it.
I want us to stay just on this subject, on the topic of net zero emissions framework. But before that, let me announce that viewers, if you are listening to us or if you are watching us, this is the Green Transition Show. If you have not subscribed to the channel, kindly subscribe to motivate us to continue to bring you very insightful topics for discussion. We are live on YouTube. We're also live on TikTok. So staying within the confines of the net zero framework, we know that in April of 2025, the IMO, which is the International Maritime Organization, approved its contentious net zero framework, but again, failed to adopt it at an extraordinary meeting in October of 2025. Can you describe the potential risks and opportunities posed by the net zero framework to developing countries, particularly those in Africa?
Thank you. So let me begin by describing what the net zero framework is in terms of its components. So like I said, the net zero framework was designed to support the implementation of the 2023 IMO GHG strategy. And the framework has a technical measure. It has set targets, emission reduction targets, where ships have to meet. So we have the direct target and also the basic target. So the ships have to strive to meet those particular targets using compliant fuels. That is bunker fuels to be used on board, or technologies to be used on board the vessel. So the Net Zero Framework basically awards rewards to ships that use, compliant green fuels, or any fuel that is compliant, that is within the emission reduction targets that is set. And it also penalizes ships that do not use those compliant fuels. And to the extent that ships that use lower emitting fuels will be paying $100 per ton of carbon equivalent emissions. For instance, if you are using lower emission, maybe like LNG, and other lower emitting fuels, you pay lower 100. But if you are using the traditional fuel, the heavy fuel oils, for instance, on board your vessel, you'll be paying as much as $380 per ton of carbon equivalent. So that is quite enormous. And so I'll come to explain how this is linked to the risks and the opportunities later on. But considering the amount that these vessels have to pay, so that actually speaks a lot. And the aim is to ensure that there's a level playing field, because the new compliant fuels, we have what we call the transitional fuels that will be used within the shorter period. We could have maybe LNG, for instance, is a transitional fuel. We also have biofuels, which are also transitional. They won't be long term. And the long-term fuels will be more of renewable energy source, like the green hydrogen, green ammonia, green methanol. Those are the long-term fuels. And these alternative fuels or greener fuels are more expensive than the traditional fuels, fossil-based fuels that the ships are using. So by imposing penalties, on the use of the traditional-based fuels, it's meant to ensure a level playing field so that ships do not continue to, use fossil-based fuels as business, to continue as business as usual. So another component of the Net Zero Framework is that it will establish a fund. So the fund will manage, the revenues collected from ships. That is, will be collecting the penalties, and also not only collecting, also disbursing these the revenues to ships using the compliant fuels as rewards. So they'll get rewards, and also the fund will also manage the purchase of what we call remedial units. So if a ship is those using lower compliant units within the $100 rank, will have to purchase, those units to be compliant from the fund. That is one aspect. The other aspect of the fund is to ensure just and equitable transition for developing countries. The fund is to support the energy transition of developing countries, which we all fall under, and it will also address the disproportionate negative impact, that would arise from the implementation of the strategy of the framework, and it also used to fund issues such as capacity building, technology transfer, and address other issues that developing countries will have challenges with. But the question here is, is the quantity of the fund and access, the quantity of access. Yeah. So the other component to the fund makes provision for food security to be addressed, because that is one of the key issues. So those are basically the main components: the rewards part, the penalty aspect, the fund, and there are other couple of components there, but these are the major components. Now, coming to talk about risks and opportunities, so we just have to link all this. First, starting with the risks, especially for developing countries, including those in Africa here. We very much see that if a ship is going to spend so much money on more expensive alternative fuels, or on the other hand, if the ship is going to pay penalties, of course, as a business person or a business entity, the ship will not bear that cost. This means that the cost of transport logistics is going to increase, and the ship owner is likely not going to bear that cost. They are going to push it to freight. Freight rates will go high to the extent that the importer may be in Ghana or in Kenya or in Nigeria importing goods, will have to do that at a higher cost. So this definitely will lead to a lot of disproportionate negative impacts. So in the first place, there will be impacts on food security, but food commodities, the price of food commodities will go high, especially for net food importing countries. There will also be an effect on the GDPs of countries, the import sector, the trade, import and export sector, because if you're also exporting your goods and then the goods go at a higher price, it means that the goods can lose their competitive edge. So those are all the potential impacts that this particular framework can have on us. And I've also mentioned the issue of food security, which is quite big for a lot of African countries. Yeah, and also, we are also talking about resources. Countries with oil and gas resources, for instance, they're also going to be impacted, because the whole aim about this is to move away from fossil-based fuels to alternative fuels. So it means that the share of fossil-based fuels in maritime bunkering means putting the fuel into ships, to power the engines. By moving away from those fossil-based fuels to greener fuels, it means that the market for those fuels will be reduced, which means that countries relying on oil and gas, will also be impacted. And then we're also talking about the other category of impact, apart from the disproportionate negative impact, is the implementation challenges, which is quite peculiar to many developing countries, African countries in particular. Here we are talking about fuels, access to those fuels. The capacity of of our countries to produce, those fuels. We don't have the technology, the technical know-how, because alternative fuel is particular fuel type that the technology is not known to many developing countries. It's within the global north. That technology is within the global north, and we're also talking about the fact that ports, all other sectors, maritime sectors that I mentioned, will have to undertake roles to ensure that their sectors are decarbonized. When we come to port, port will have to undertake certain roles. They have to make sure that they look into their infrastructure, the port infrastructure, the bunkering infrastructure, and because many of the infrastructure in place now is meant for the oil and gas sector. So it means that they'll need a different kind of infrastructure to ensure that their bunker vessels that come to berth at those ports. So it will involve investments. And the ships that we are also talking about, when you look at most African ships, for instance, they are quite aging. So it means that they have to undertake a lot of measures like retrofitting, putting dual engines, maybe to accommodate for more cleaner fuel use, or undertaking other onboard, carbon capture activities, which will be quite capital intensive. So these are all the challenges that will come up, which are actually core concerns concerning the net zero framework. So the factors that are actually impeding the implementation of this framework are quite many. We have regulatory, because the capacity of, for instance, the maritime administrations, we have to ensure that they have the capacity to inspect, ships that come, to ensure the ships are compliant. And we also have there are people who survey ships, they also have to have the technical know-how. We have seafarers, the people who work on ships. They have to also ensure that, they have the capacity to work on newer engines, those engines meant for the alternative fuels, because they're used to the traditional engines for now. which means those are all challenges that we have to consider when looking at the net zero framework. All these factors actually came into play during the October meeting that you talked about, because a lot of countries raised concerns, and there was major pushback from the major oil producing countries, especially from the Gulf. And there were also concerns, a bit of geopolitics, with the United States of America, for instance. The current administration's policy on climate change is quite clear. So they even issued démarche, to countries, not only African countries. They issued the démarche to all countries globally, including the EU countries, threatening sanctions if any country supported that measure. But the core of the issue had to do with these concerns of negative impact and concerns of implementation challenges. So basically, these are the broader risks. So now the opportunities, especially for African countries, the opportunities are quite there, because now when you look into Africa in particular, we are very much endowed with renewable energy potential. You have abundant solar. A lot of countries use hydro. And so we can actually leverage on that, to ensure that we can produce these greener fuels. Other African countries have taken the lead. We have Namibia producing green hydrogen. We have South Africa also doing so. We have Morocco looking into ammonia. There are countries that have already taken the lead in trying to take up the opportunities that will be presented by this transition. And we also have there's also the opportunity to ensure the creation of green jobs, because with this, greener fuel production comes, within the value chain, a lot of jobs can be created for the teeming African population. Africa has more youth population than any other continent, so we can actually leverage on that. And I think that with our seafaring in particular, if you are able to retool the workforce, the maritime workforce, to be familiar with this, the transition, the working on board and handling of these greener fuels, they can actually take up jobs, and it's like we'll be starting from the scratch with the rest of the world, and whatever opportunities that will be available, we can train our seafarers and maritime workforce to also ensure that they have the capabilities to compete, with their counterparts elsewhere. And we can also, another opportunity that we can actually leverage, developing countries, in particular Africa, can leverage on this to increase their renewable energy potential, because through investment in renewable energy for maritime sector, it can also be used for other sectors. And in the long run, it will, bring about energy security, for a lot of people. And not only that, it also lead to cleaner air and better living, especially around port communities. And eventually it will also contribute to, the global temperature goals, the Paris Agreement temperature goals. So basically, broadly, these are the risks and the opportunities that we can actually see from the net zero framework. But unfortunately, the adoption was adjourned by 1 year, and there are actually a lot of complications. So no one knows what will happen in the next round of negotiations, whether it's going to be adopted, it's going to be postponed again, it's going to be amended. It's quite unclear. Yeah, but the interplay of all these factors, the economic factors in particular, and geopolitics, all these are playing a role in getting the sector decarbonized.
Yeah. Viewers, if you are watching us, kindly go to YouTube and subscribe to the Green Transition Show so that we'll continue to bring you insightful topics. Now, in your view, Numbu, in your view, should maritime climate regulation be driven globally or through regional mechanisms such as emission trading systems? What do you think?
Yes. So in my view, I think that we should have a global framework, for regulating maritime emissions. especially from international shipping. When you look at the initial discussions that we had, we are saying that the fact that the sector is international in nature, it can be, emissions from shipping, international shipping cannot be categorized within one particular country or one particular region. And that should tell us that there should be a regional framework, an international framework, so a global framework to ensure that we have global standards, standard for phasing out the emissions, and which will also take into consideration, the capabilities, respective capabilities of all other countries, and especially those from the developing world. For instance, the net zero framework that we are talking about, it makes provision for a fund, to help, the developing countries in their transition. Existing regional frameworks that we have now, like the European Union, ETS, and I think now the major regional the major regional frameworks that we have is that implemented by the EU, and you can see that they are already causing havoc to trade. We are importing because they are targeting international shipping. We are importing at much higher, much higher rates, and yet we don't benefit anything, from those measures because they are regional. The benefits go to the EU countries. EU countries do not benefit anything, but they pay more. And so what if we say that Africa, because maybe EU is implementing a regional measure, Africa should also implement a regional measure? That, of course, I've already outlined the potential impact. So all this, will go to increase cost of doing business, cost of maritime transport, which will, in effect, reflect in the consumer prices. It will reflect in almost every basic good that we have access to, we can have access to. But by having a single global framework, the International Maritime Organization is going to regulate the implementation, addressing the risks, addressing the potential impact, and also ensuring that countries are able to transition in a just and equitable manner. So basically, global frameworks far outweigh the regional measures that we have.
Okay, so what about developing countries? I want to specifically talk about countries in Africa. How can countries in Africa or smaller port economies avoid being left out of the green maritime transition?
Yes. So basically, that is actually the problem. When you look at most developing countries, in Africa especially, we've contributed little to the phenomena, the climate change phenomena, and yet we bear, much more of climate impacts. But when you look at the shipping industry, the regulations that are adopted at the IMO, the concept of common but differentiated responsibilities is not quite applicable within the IMO environment. So it's quite difficult to say, okay, this regulation is in place. Maybe Kenya or Ghana or Nigeria will have to have their own ways of implementing it. Once a particular measure is adopted at the IMO, it has a global binding effect. So irrespective of whether you have the capability, you don't have, once a vessel flying your flag goes out, the vessel has to comply. And likewise, as a port state, to any vessel coming to your port, you have to ensure that they comply with the requirements. So it has that global binding effect. And using the example of the net zero framework again, what are the strategies that developing African countries can actually undertake to ensure that the transition in a just manner? Here we're talking about just an equitable transition. I think that is basically the phrase used in place of the CBDR RC principle at the IMO. Yeah, so I think that I'll start with the national level. Countries need to develop clear national decarbonization frameworks or strategies, because without those clear strategies, implementing those global maritime emission regulations will be quite difficult. But if you have a national framework or a national action plan for shipping decarbonization, it will outline the various stakeholders. It will bring everyone on board, all the relevant stakeholders on board, and you have a national strategy to reducing emissions within the domestic maritime sector. You also have strategies in the national strategies for reducing the impact, the impact of the measures, the GHG measures, and as well as the opportunities that you can undertake. All these can be outlined in the national strategy or action plan. And another one that I'll have to talk about, still at the national level, countries can develop import substitution policies. Well, we've outlined how the increase in transport logistics costs, can result in increased consumer prices or increase in cost of imports. And if a particular country, devises import substitution policies, for instance, if a country imports a lot of poultry, and you start, with a national plan to start producing local produce, poultry, it means that you end up cutting down on your import, and whether those imports are affected by higher freight rates or not, the impact will not appear. It will not be negative on the country. Yeah. Same with other areas in terms of agri, even other industrial, activities as well. So the other issue I would say is at the regional level, where we need to adopt, within the African continent in particular, proper regional measures, deliberate regional measures, in case a policy like the Net Zero Framework is adopted. First, to see how the impacts through trade basically can be minimized in the region in totality, and also to see how it can even result in more trade, increased trade activities within intra-African trade, in a way that will be more beneficial to all the countries. So here the roles of the AFCFT and AU will be quite relevant in coordinating such regional measures. And also there needs to be more cooperation between the global South countries in terms of capacity building, knowledge exchange, and we also need to ensure that we take advantage of the green opportunities. For instance, there can be regional cooperation on what we call green shipping corridors. Green shipping corridors are basically shipping routes, between major port hubs, where you can actually implement and support decarbonization initiatives by making available, green fuels and other technologies to support that particular route. We can have a route, for instance, from Tema Port to Lagos, Lome, Lagos corridor, where you can say, okay, we want to make this particular route green. And what do? It means that you need to ensure that you're able to produce those greener fuels, and you're also able to deploy them at vantage points. In the long run, you are going to have expanded industries and creating jobs along the value chain. And one last thing is to ensure that we get sustainable financing to finance all these projects, because they are quite capital intensive. So with all this in place, if we're able to undertake these strategies, in my opinion, I think that we can actually transition in a just manner to ensure that we are not left, no country will be left behind.
What about the private sector? What role does the private sector has in accelerating the decarbonization efforts?
Yes, I think the private sector actually is supposed to play a major role here. When you look at the CAFEs, of most developing countries, is not much. And when you look at what we are talking about, purchasing new vessels, new greener vessels. We are talking about building alternative energy plants, quite expensive. A smaller plant of green hydrogen, I understand, could cost about $20 million. So how much more a bigger one? So it's actually capital intensive. So first, the private sector needs to come in. It could be anyone, for instance, within the financial sector, to invest, either by sole venture or by joint, public-private partnerships with the government. And so we are talking about the fuel private sector in fuel producing areas, to spare the transition. We are talking about vessel ownership, because we need investment from the private sector to invest. And also, we're also talking about the financing aspect. For the financing aspect, we could get private sector, and also we could get those green climate access of funds from these green climate funds as well, to support the investment portfolio. So the private sector is quite key, and the government cannot do it alone. The various government cannot do it alone. And like I said, even though the Net Zero Framework makes provision for a fund, the revenue from the fund may not be enough, to undertake all these green initiatives. So there's a need, the need for heavy private sector involvement in all this.
Looking ahead to 2050, what critical policy decisions over the next 5 years will determine whether or not the maritime sector achieves a net zero emission target?
Yes, so that is quite a long one, considering where we are now. For instance, so last year, the framework, net zero framework, was supposed to be adopted, and then it would have come into force somewhere 2027. But now there's a delay by 1 year, and no one knows what's going to happen next. So I think that the upcoming negotiations, and also within the next 5 years, there should be one deliberate effort at consensus building, on the global framework as to how it will be designed. So they need to factor in all the differences and the concerns that people have raised, which largely border on economic issues. So I think that if there's that consensus building, and the IMO member states come up with a much agreeable framework, irrespective of whether the ambition is much lower. So I think that having consensus on a lower framework, at least for the start, is very important. Gradually, there can be incremental efforts at increasing the ambition. So looking at 2050 is even more of a doubt to me. But when you look at the IMO GHG strategy, it doesn't say 2050 exactly. It says by or around 2050, which means that it can be before, by, or a little beyond 2050. But I think that if there's consensus on a framework which takes into consideration the negative impact, the genuine concerns of countries, I think countries will be gradually be in a position to be able to implement such a framework. So that is consensus building. And like I've also mentioned that technical regulation, the global technical regulation, a global technical regulation is needed, like I said, irrespective of the ambition, because it will indicate the manner in which emissions will be phased out in the industry. So once we have that technical regulation, and also economic regulation as well. So if we have technical regulation alone, the impact will come. This same impact, whether it's a lower ambition, the impacts will come to bear on African countries and other developing countries, and there'll be no funds to address those impacts. So there should be both technical and economic regulations as part of the strategy, and also, whatever be the case, there should be deliberate attempts to ensure that the needs of developing countries in terms of the impact of such a measure, and also those regarding implementation challenges, are addressed. Otherwise, if we even have a lower ambition, a less ambitious framework, and a lot of countries will still have problems implementing such a framework. And we have, let me just give an example. In 2020, there was a similar regulation, the IMO sulfur cap regulation, which it was a regulation to reduce the sulfur content in fuel used by ships from 3.5% to 0.5%. So that is, in fact, it has come into force, but a lot of countries are still having problems, implementing such a policy. And there are even some other short-term measures that have been rolled out, but countries are having, capacity challenges. So they need to ensure that, countries within our side of the world, the global south, are actually assisted. They are given the necessary support from IMO and other bodies of interest to ensure that the capacity is developed and that those negative impacts are addressed before. In that way, we'll be sure that we will have that global framework that will actually be workable, for a lot of countries.
Viewers, if you are watching us or listening to us, this is the Green Transition Show. If you have not subscribed to the channel, kindly go to YouTube and subscribe so that we'll continue to bring you very insightful topics for discussion. If you're on TikTok, you can follow us. You can follow us as well. So my final question is about young professionals. There are people who are in the universities, others have just completed and doing their national service, or others have started their careers, but they may want to transition into the maritime industry. What advice will you give to these young professionals who want to pursue a career within the maritime industry?
Yes. So the maritime industry is quite, it has many lucrative offers. So let me just start with one. One is the seafaring opportunities. So from the onset, maybe from the senior high school level, the young careers will have to make up their minds because, for instance, if you want to work in the engine room or the deck side of the ship, you need to have specialized training, maritime related courses. And in Ghana currently we have the Regional Maritime University providing those courses, courses in nautical science, courses in marine engineering. So once you take up such a course, definitely you are building a career towards that. And with the seafaring too, irrespective of whether you have background, you have first degree in those related areas, there are other paths of progression that you can undertake. For instance, someone can read general arts from senior high school or even from the junior high school, and you can still go to sea. You can work on ships. You can go as ordinary seaman, and gradually you climb up the ladder. That notwithstanding, there are other careers within the maritime sector in terms of supply and logistics. Working with shipping companies. There are other careers you can take up in logistics supply chain, and apart from the seafaring. And like I said, now that the sector is decarbonizing, there will be other opportunities in terms of green jobs and alternative fuel production aspects. So there are a lot of prospects within the sector. And I think that the advice is that the young professionals need to be deliberate in terms of where they want to work. And I think getting the necessary advice, career advice, is also quite important to see where they can actually fit within the maritime sector.
Okay. Viewers, we have come to the end of today's discussion. I'm sure you have enjoyed the depth of knowledge that our guest, Numbu Issahaque Sumabe, has demonstrated in today's discussion. If you have enjoyed it, I urge you to go to YouTube and subscribe to the channel, comment, like the various videos, and share with your friends and your colleagues so that next week we'll bring you another insightful discussion. We thank our guest for the time and for sharing with us his knowledge about the maritime industry. Thank you, viewers, and thank you, listeners, as well. We'll meet again next time. Bye for now.